Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 308. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Got some news to catch up on here at Conflicts of Interest. I took the past week off of the show to enjoy getting married and all of that, so trying to catch up here. And today I'm going to start by going over most of the Russia news that's recurring war news that has come out over the past 2 weeks. But I also got some other stories here too. And then this week I'll have Dave DeCamp on the show, Connor Freeman on the show to talk about China and Russia. So a lot of great stuff coming up this week, a lot of important news to cover. So be sure to share today's show. Is hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. You can find the video version at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. You could donate to the show at Patreon, Subscribestar, and Crypto. All that information in the show notes page. And you could support the show by doing your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE. That will save you 20% when you spend $75 or more, and it gets the show a kit badge. So it's a great way to help your favorite podcast and at the same time get yourself high quality CBD products. Everyone, I know more and more people are using the promo code. The past quarter with Paloma Verde was the best so far, and still almost, every review, but almost everyone who buys it, that they reach out to the show and they're like, hey Kyle, I really like this. The dog treats are probably what we actually get the most feedback on. I know Connor loves them for his dog, and I've talked to several other listeners who say that the dog treats are very helpful. My favorite product is the sports cream, but whatever you got going on, there's probably something that could help you at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. Let's get into this episode. First up today, President Biden held a meeting along with Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hitz that was virtual with the CEO of Lockheed Martin and representatives from other companies to discuss advancing a piece of legislation that would subsidize the domestic manufacturing of semiconductors. The legislation, known as the CHIPS Act, that's all capital CHIPS, was advanced in the Senate last week. The bill would authorize $50 billion in subsidies to boost chip manufacturing, according to the Military Times. The legislation would add $79 billion to the deficit over 10 years. The subsidies for chip making were originally part of the massive $250 billion bill meant to compete with China, but the final legislation stalled due to partisan differences. The Senate is expected to vote on the finalized version of the CHIPS Act this week. The Pentagon and arms makers want the CHIPS Act to pass as semiconductors are needed to produce advanced weapons. The U.S. also views chip making as vital part of competing with China. Semiconductors is not overstated to say our ground zero for our technological competition with China, said the Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hitz. And so the U.S. is doing all this to help our military industrial complex, but critically, there are a lot of problems going on with our, military industrial complex, the weapons that we're making, particularly the F-35, which is made by Lockheed Martin. This was just from the Air Force Times that they have a problem with the injector seats, and they had a malfunctioning cartridge in one of the seats. And that means that, if one of our pilots trains on the F-35, something goes wrong with the plane, and lots of things have gone wrong with those planes, and the pilot needs to inject, that cartridge will not fire, or at least not strong enough to get the pilot out of the plane, and will result in the pilot's death. And so this is what we're looking at. These are the serious problems that continue to exist with the F-35 project, even though the U.S. continues to dump massive amounts of money into Lockheed Martin. They apparently only found this on one plane. The Air Force Times says they don't know the scope of the problems yet, but they have ungrounded the F-35 fleet. Also, the U.S. Fort Bragg had to shut down entire barracks. 1,200 soldiers are going to have to be housed somewhere else because of a black mold problem at the base. This is just how poorly the U.S. military is run, that we have all these sustaining problems with our military infrastructure, not only the advanced new equipment we're building, but also just where we house our soldiers. And, it's crazy that we're picking so much provocative, actions towards Russia and China at this time, when if you actually look at the U.S. military capabilities, you have to wonder logistically, is the Pentagon able to fight a war? Do they have, the housing available for our soldiers where they're not going to be getting sick if we put them there? Can we put them in planes that function and things like that? I think these are real questions that we need to ask our military. And again, Congress doesn't. They just give more and more money to the military industrial complex. Now, I want to take a minute to talk about two stories here, and they're important because this weekend and coming week are the anniversaries of the U.S. using nuclear weapons in Japan at the end of World War II. Of course, and just absolutely terrible things the U.S. did there, but also with the U.S. Creating this situation around Taiwan now to go along with Russia. A lot of people had already felt that we are at the closest point to nuclear war since the Cold War, and now adding China into the midst is only going to make it worse. So this is from Dave DeCamp, dated August 1st. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned humanity is just one misunderstanding, one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation. Guterres made the warning at a conference of countries that are signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT, which entered into force in 1970. The UN chief said the war in Ukraine and the global tensions have put a world in a time of nuclear danger not seen since the height of the Cold War. Russian President Vladimir Putin addressed the NPT conference participants in a letter where he warned that nuclear war must never happen. We perceive from the fact that there can be no winners in a nuclear war, it should never be unleashed. We stand for equal and indivisible security for all members of the world community. It's widely believed that the direct confrontation between the U.S. and Russia would quickly spiral into nuclear war. The chances of such a conflict are heightened as the U.S. and its NATO allies are funding the war in Ukraine on Russia's border and are shipping billions in weapons into the war zone. Besides supporting the war against Russia, the U.S. is also raising tensions with China by challenging Beijing on the Taiwan issue. But it's not just the UN here. This is also from a British official. This is July 28th from Dave DeCamp. British National Security Advisor Stephen Lovegrove warned Thursday that there is a greater risk of nuclear war today than during the Cold War due to a lack of communication channels. The Cold War's two monolithic blocs, the USSR, Soviet Union, and NATO, though not without alarming bumps, were able to reach shared understanding a doctrine that today is absent, Lovegrove said. He said during the Cold War, there was an understanding of the Soviet doctrine and capabilities and vice versa because they kept more negotiation channels open. This gave us both higher levels of confidence that we would not miscalculate our way into nuclear war. Today, we do not have that same foundations with others who may threaten the future, particularly with China. Today, there is only one remaining nuclear arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia, the New START, which limits the deployment of nuclear warheads, bombers, and submarines and missiles. And so I think this is a really good point that we're getting from the UK government here, particularly on the China issue, and particularly after this past weekend where China cut off military communications with the US over Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Now, when we look at what's happening with nuclear weapons, is we also have to look going into the future here, because as Dave DeCamp points out in that article, the last remaining nuclear arms agreement between Russia and China that actually, or not Russia and China, the U.S. and Russia, that actually limits the number of nuclear weapons, the deployment of nuclear weapons, is the New START treaty, and that will expire in 2026. And so while it was just reauthorized in 2021 for a 5-year extension, Joe Biden did that at the beginning of his administration, administration, I think on the show we widely agree that up there with getting out of Afghanistan, but that was done poorly. Extending New START is probably the most important thing that Joe Biden has done as president. And, it now seems that the environment that Russia and China would have to have this negotiation cannot happen. At least it cannot happen in a Democratic White House, or you gotta see what you're gonna get with different people running for office. But certainly now anybody within the political establishment, it would maybe have to be like a Rand Paul type that would actually be willing to negotiate with Russia at this point. And that's essentially the statements that we're getting from the U.S., where Biden's saying, well, we're not unwilling to do it, but at the same time, all the conditions that they set forth are basically red lines, are things that aren't going to happen. Russia says the U.S. has shown no interest in negotiating New START. The Kremlin, this is from August 2nd, the Kremlin said that Washington hasn't shown interest in negotiating a replacement for New START, the last nuclear arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia that will expire in 2026. The comments from the Kremlin came after President Biden said his administration was ready to expeditiously negotiate a replacement for New START, but signaled that the U.S. wouldn't enter arms control talks with Russia because of the war in Ukraine. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said the Russian officials have been calling for negotiations to replace New START. However, it's the U.S. that is showing no interest in any substantive contacts, which are highly necessary, Peskov told reporters, according to the Russian news agency TASS. So that is more or less where we are on the nuclear issue. Now I want to get into some more stories about Ukraine, but there was talks between Blinken and Lavrov that I'll get into a little bit later. Now, this is maybe the most important story that I have to cover since I've been out, just because how unique it is, I think, where a lot of the other stuff I'm talking about, my audience is familiar with, although it's very important to discuss, the new arms transfers that are going to Ukraine. So Amnesty International says Ukraine's fighting tactics endanger civilians. This is from August 4th by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Amnesty International on Thursday said that Ukraine is endangering civilians in its warfighting tactics by establishing bases and launching attacks from residential areas, including schools and hospitals. Angus Kalaman, Amnesty International Secretary General, said, "We have documented a pattern of Ukrainian forces putting civilians at risk and violating laws of war when they operate in populated areas. Being in defensive positions does not exempt the Ukrainian military from respecting international humanitarian law." Amnesty said most residential areas in Ukraine where Ukrainian soldiers locate themselves were kilometers away from front lines that were viable alternatives that would not have endangered civilians. The NGO said it found Ukrainian forces using hospitals as de facto military bases in 5 locations. In 22 out of 29 schools that Amnesty visited, their researchers found soldiers entering the premises or found evidence of current or prior military activity. Amnesty said that as a result of Ukraine's tactics, Russia's strikes in populated areas killed civilians. However, the NGO said that not every Russia attack followed this pattern, and they could accuse Moscow of war crimes in Kharkiv. They did not find Ukraine using civilian areas as bases. Amnesty also noted that Ukraine's tactics do not excuse Russia's indiscriminate attacks. Ukraine reacted angrily to Amnesty's report, with Ukrainian foreign minister saying he was outraged. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky accused the NGO of helping terrorists by publishing the report. Kalamard called on Ukraine to ensure that the areas it uses as bases are away from populated areas. Military should never use hospitals to engage in warfare and should only use schools or civilian homes as a last resort when there are no viable alternatives, she said. And this is in line with what we have talked about in the past on the show, that Ukraine has been using these areas, has been deploying their weapons here. Now, the other thing to note, and Russia is doing this too, this is expected to happen during warfare. That's not an excuse, but anytime you have war, this is why I'm anti-war, is that you're going to end up with more and more situations like this. Next up, Biden authorizes additional $550 million military aid package for Ukraine. And according to the Pentagon, the new package includes an unspecified amount of ammunition for the HIMARS, the high mobility artillery rocket systems, and 775,000 rounds of ammunition for the 55 millimeter howitzers the U.S. has already provided to Ukraine. The new aid was authorized by the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows Biden to send weapons and ammunition from Ukraine directly from U.S. stockpiles. And then this is my article from Friday at antiwar.com. The White House will approve new $1 billion weapons transfer to Ukraine. We are expected to get that finalized this week. Reuters reports unnamed officials in the Biden administration say a new $1 billion weapons package is waiting for the president's signature. The next arms transfer will be the 18 cents Russia invaded Ukraine in February. President Joe Biden will use the Presidential Drawdown Authority, or the PDA, to fund the security assistance package. In May, Congress placed billions into the PDA, allowing the White House to send Kiev increasingly sophisticated weapons with little oversight. According to the Department of Defense, the new package will bring the total military aid to Kiev to nearly $10 billion. While the details of the new aid package have yet to be finalized, it is expected to include more long-range rockets and air defense ammunition. The U.S. has shipped 16 HIMARS systems to Ukraine. Ukrainian official recently said the U.S. was consulted about an attack on Russian forces using the long-range rocket system. Moscow claims Washington's assistance to Kiev now amounts to direct war between the two countries. Igor Konsharaба, a spokesperson for the Russian Defense Ministry, said Washington is directly involved in the conflict in Ukraine. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has repeatedly warned that transfers of HIMARS to Ukraine will cause Moscow to take more territory. The White House has not commented on the package. The anonymous officials speaking with Reuters said National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, NASAMS, and as many as 50 M113 armored medical transport vehicles will likely be included in the new package as well. Now, all this has led to a very stern warning, or not warning, I guess, but statement from Russia. This from Dave DeCamp on July 25th at antiwar.com. Lavrov says Russia will help Ukrainians to get rid of the regime. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Sunday that Moscow will help the Ukrainian people get rid of the regime in Kiev, suggesting Russia's war aims have expanded even more. We will certainly help the Ukrainian people get rid of the regime, which is ultimately anti-people and anti-historical, Lavrov said in Egypt. Earlier in the war, Russia says its focus was to liberate the breakaway republics in the eastern Donbass region, but Lavrov said last week that Russia's goals now extend beyond the Donbass into Kherson and the Zaporizhzhia Oblast and a number of other territories. And by the way, I know I mispronounced those, but those are two pieces of territory that are north of the Crimean Peninsula in Ukraine. It's not clear from Lavrov's comments on Sunday if Moscow decided to pursue regime change in Ukraine as its official policy. Lavrov previously said Russia wasn't looking to depose Zelensky. I find this extremely interesting because in my analysis on the war, as I'm sure listeners of this show are aware of, I'm not sure that Russia really wants to depose Zelensky, and my thinking even now is that Zelensky may be the most rational and most less Ukrainian ethno-nationalist candidate that is going to get elected at this point, in large part because of the Russian invasion and because as Russia lops off more and more Ukrainian territory, anybody who would vote for a Ukrainian leader that, you can either look at pro-Russian, or if you just want to say a more neutral candidate or a candidate that distinctly is anti the Ukrainian nationalism, that becomes less and less likely the more and more of Ukraine that Russia annexes. And so I don't know if this is actually saying that they're looking to depose Zelensky. I think that the elements in the regime in Kiev that Russia is concerned about are probably different than Zelensky himself. And we can't be sure, but it's hard to imagine that if Russia's goal here really was to, just take out Zelensky, that they wouldn't have at least tried a couple assassination strikes on him by this point. But as far as I could tell, that hasn't happened at all. And so that makes me question if Russia is really looking to depose him. Bridges closed in Russia held Kherson after Ukraine HIMARS strike. And this is just a detail. I'm not going to go through this whole story, but the Ukraine is using the U.S. made rocket systems to target infrastructure in Ukraine, and then a drone attack hit Russia's Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Crimea. While I don't have any real status update on the war, it seems to be pretty much status quo from the last time I talked about, which is Russia is making some slow gains at high cost to both sides, but to Russia they're losing equipment, they're losing forces. Ukraine, same situation, but they are slowly losing territory. As I mentioned in my article before, that the Russian Defense Ministry has said that Washington is directly involved in the war in Ukraine. I just wanted to highlight this article by Dave DeCamp on it because I think this is really important. What happened here is the deputy head of Ukraine's military intelligence told the Telegraph that Ukrainian officials consulted with the U.S. before launching HIMARS strikes and that the U.S. has veto power over the attacks. The Ukrainian official insisted that the U.S. wasn't providing any direct targeting information, but suggested that Ukraine was using satellite imagery by the U.S. and Britain. I can't tell you whether we are directly taking British and American satellites, but we have very good satellite imagery. And I think that comes with a wink and a nod there. So you had this situation, right, where the U.S. apparently has veto power over the Ukrainian HIMARS strike. So that means any strike they're carrying out, they're approving. And while the U.S. may try to play degrees of separation here and that we're not actually directly involved in the war, if the U.S. does have intelligence on where Russians are and they're saying, well, don't strike, here, here, or here, then, the one option you leave open, you're kind of telling the Ukrainians that that's where the Russians are. And so it may be a little bit of a de facto, but it seems like the U.S. at this point, could be said, is helping to Ukraine to pit targets. So there's, a lot going on with Ukraine, and they're asking for a lot. The Ukrainian government is now requesting Washington to provide Kiev with a lend-lease program to import natural gas from the U.S. to ensure Ukraine has enough heat for winter. As far as trade goes, this is fine. The problem is that if we're subsidizing the corrupt Ukrainian government to do it, this starts to get problematic. And so we'll see how this plays out, but definitely something to look at as we extend into this war. It's not only billions of dollars on weapons, but it's just billions of dollars of direct aid to the Ukrainian government. And we really should be asking and we should be demanding that our politicians have some level of accountability and oversight to make sure that at least a good percentage of that money is making it to the Ukrainian people, which at this point I doubt is happening. Now, there is this saying that beggars can't be choosers, but Ukraine doesn't want old US A-10 planes. A Ukrainian official said Tuesday that Kiev doesn't want American A-10 Warthog planes after the U.S. Air Force official suggested that the U.S. might send the older aircraft to Ukraine. Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall was asked if the U.S. could send A-10s to Ukraine, which the Air Force is phasing out, and he said that's up to Ukraine. And now Ukraine says they don't want them. Now, I guess from Ukraine's perspective, maybe that's going to give up too much leverage. They want their pilots trained on fighter jets and not on the A-10s, or maybe they feel like there's some reason that it's really not going to work for the Ukrainians on the battlefield. And then, it's just going to make the American people say, oh, we're sending more and more weapons to Ukraine. And so there may be logistical problems with this. It may not just be the Ukrainians being very choosy about the kind of donations that they're getting. So this is, I think, is one of the more important stories that while I was out, just because it's a real follow up on something that the Hawks were trying to make a lot of ground with. U.S. says it has not seen signs of Russian buying drones from Iran. A spokesperson for the White House National Security Council said that the U.S. has not seen any signs Russia is purchasing drones from Iran despite earlier claims from Washington. We've seen no indications of any sort of actual deliveries and or purchases of Iranian drones by the Russian Defense Ministry, National Security spokesperson John Kirby told Al Arabiya. Earlier this month, on the eve of President Biden's trip to the Middle East, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan claimed without evidence that the U.S. had information that Iran was preparing to provide Russia with hundreds of drones. The claims from Sullivan were not the first time that since Russia invaded Ukraine that accusations from the U.S. related to the war never materialized. Back in March, U.S. officials claimed in comments to the media that Russia asked China for military assistance in Ukraine, and Sullivan warned Beijing that helping Moscow's war effort. Both Russia and China denied the claims, and there hasn't been any indication that Beijing was helping Moscow's war efforts. NBC News later reported that the U.S. has no hard evidence to back up the claim. So it's just part of information warfare waged by the U.S. All of this, though, has led Russia to look at a new naval strategy. Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a new naval doctrine that names the U.S. as Moscow's main rival on the seas. And this is, I'm sure, long been true in the case. So I'm not sure what it's actually going to change, but I think it's worth noting. Here we go. Stoltenberg, that is the Secretary General of the NATO alliance, says NATO working with arms industry to get Ukraine more weapons. Stoltenberg said the military alliance was working closely with arms industry to get more weapons to Ukraine and said more must be done to support Kiev for the long haul. We are providing a lot of support but we need to do even more and be prepared for the long haul. Therefore, we are also now in close contact and working closely with the defense industry to produce more and deliver more different types of ammunition and weapons capabilities. Of course, the more advanced weapons you give Ukraine, the more it's going to upset Russia and the more likely that this conflict really spirals out of control. Now, a little bit of good news here. Actually, I got a couple good news stories here. The first is that the first ship carrying Ukrainian grain leaves Odessa under new deal, and I believe that this ship and a second ship actually have now cleared Turkish inspection and are leaving. That would be the Black Sea. I think it's the Strait of Malinu, and then going out into the Aegean Sea or the Mediterranean Sea to deliver the grain to the rest of the world. And so this is huge for getting the people of the world more to eat. Of course, just a couple of ships isn't going to do what needs to be done. The grain deal was signed with the hopes of unlocking an estimated 22 million tons of grain, and doing so is going to take a lot of ships to move all that grain. And so, that maybe as more ships get through this, it's going to help pick up the pace, and this is going to start to come faster and faster. But very important news here, and good to see something positive here. Although, of course, it's a pretty limited victory at this point. Now, other good news, this from Connor Freeman, writing a news story for antiwar.com. Connor, of course, the co-host of this show. Really excited to see him helping out the news section at antiwar.com as well. Blinken holds first call with Lavrov since February. Ceasefires not discussed. During a news conference on Friday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced he held a call with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov on a potential bilateral prisoner exchange. A State Department official said the call lasted approximately 25 minutes. Washington and Moscow's top diplomats discussed the Ukraine export deal brokered by the UN and Turkey with Kiev and Moscow. Reportedly, also a part of the dialogue was the U.S. role sanctions play in provoking the movement of Russian food supplies and fertilizer. This is the first time Blinken has spoken with Lavrov since February 15th, more than a week before Russia invaded Ukraine. 5 months into the war, amid economic turmoil, the American-led sanctions blitz has caused there to be no indication that Blinken will attempt to push for a ceasefire or negotiations to end the conflict. The call appears to have been primarily focused on a tentative deal to release 2 Americans that Russia has detained. I think one is Paul Whelan, who has been in Russia for several years. And initially on the show, I had speculated that his arrest was simply in retaliation for the American treatment of Maria Butina, who got caught up in all of this Russiagate nonsense. And that as Butina got released, so would Paul Whelan. The story against him sounds something similar to the plot of Enemy of the State, the old Will Smith and Gene Hackman movie, where Whelan claims that somehow a device got dropped into his bag that did contain secret Russian information. However, Whelan's perspective is that wasn't actually true, that he was just being set up or something. And then there is WNBA player Brittany Grenier, who was convicted or pled guilty to bringing cannabis oil into Russia. I've read a source that said there was only 0.7 grams of cannabis there, so I'm not quite sure exactly where all the calculations are on this and everything. Now, Russia does have fairly hard weed laws, and so it's not, I guess, completely. I mean, they threw the book at her, but at the same time, it's not like the most absurd thing that Russia throws the book at drug offenders, from my understanding. However, I'm sure that a lot of what's going on with her is wrapped up in the political situation between the U.S. and Russia. Now, the U.S., I think, is in a somewhat complicated position here, right? On actual issues, what we talked about at the start of this show with the nuclear weapons and things like that. Brittany Grenier's case isn't on the top of issues that Russia and, the U.S. need to work through. That being said, prisoner swaps are sometimes a good way to start to facilitate talks. And I think Russia wants somebody bet the U.S. as imprisoned as an arms trader. And so, maybe this exchange could kick off some, show both sides that success can happen through diplomacy, and that we could see a ceasefire eventually materialize from it. That kind of thing is possible. But at the same time, my guess is that just as tense as things are between the U.S. and Russia, that the White House does have some pressure to get Grenier back, in the only way, you can't send the Delta Force or SEAL Team 6 into Siberia to extract Grenier from a penal colony. And so what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to negotiate with Russia. And so I think the Biden administration is willing to negotiate here, but I don't see this as a real sign that they're willing to negotiate down the road. So maybe some good news with this, that the U.S. is offering something. And also, I think the U.S. has a real perception issue here. It's not like people in the U.S. don't do long sentences for marijuana-only convictions. Obviously, this would be a rather absurd sentence to have in 2022 in the U.S., but it's not exactly possible that something like this couldn't happen. And of course, we have President and Vice President drug laws, Kamala Harris, who kept a lot of people in jail for nonviolent marijuana offenses, and of course, Joe Biden, who bragged about being the author of the 1990s crime bill. And so, with that, I'm sure to the rest of the world, the U.S. complaints here about Russia ring really hollow. The Senate passes a resolution calling for Russia to be labeled a state sponsor of terror. I believe Blinken is resisting this at this point, and it's only a resolution. I've made some arguments about why I think this would be a really bad thing. It would just deteriorate the U.S.-Russian relationship a lot. Last story here on Europe. EU members agreed to gas rationing plan with some exemptions. Hungary has rejected the plan, and so some countries are participating. We'll see how this actually works out if people are able to meet the goals here. As often, I think with these energy consumption things, people are willing to overpledge, hoping that others come through and that you can make only minimal concessions, if any. All right, big news here. Biden administration approves massive arms deal for Saudi Arabia and the UAE. This is from August 2nd. Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. The State Department approved two potential arms deals to Saudi Arabia and the UAE worth over $5 billion combined. The sale to the Saudis is for Patriot surface-to-air missiles and worth an estimated $3.5 billion. The principal contractor for the Patriots is Raytheon, former employee of Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. According to the Pentagon Defense Security Cooperation Agency, the Patriots are meant to defend the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's borders against persistent Houthi cross-border unmanned aerial systems and ballistic missile attacks. The approval for the Patriot sales comes as a fragile 4-month truce in Yemen has been extended for another 2 months, so that's some really good news there. While they're still fighting on the ground, the Saudis are still enforcing the blockade. There has been no Saudi coalition airstrikes and no Houthi attacks inside Saudi Arabia since March. The deal for the UAE is also for missile defense systems. According to the DSCA, Abu Dhabi has asked to buy the THAAD missiles and related equipment worth about $2.2 billion. The principal contractor for THAADs is Lockheed Martin. The Biden administration approved of the deal as Israel is looking to build a U.S.-backed military alliance with Gulf countries in the Middle East against Iran. The idea of the alliance is to focus integrated missile defense systems, although there has not been much public air support for the proposal. Now, Congress can still block this. Doesn't mean the deal is going to happen, but it almost always does. So I'm going to assume that this deal is going to end up going through. The problem here isn't necessarily that Saudi Arabia is going to be able to use the surface-to-air Patriot missiles to kill people in Yemen, because the Yemeni people don't really have an air force. They can launch missiles at Saudi Arabia, but that's about it. However, if there is no cost for the Saudi kingdom in this war, meaning that they could just launch airstrikes on Yemen all day long and the people of Yemen can do nothing about it, they can't inflict any pain on Saudi Arabia in response, then we will get what we saw for the first 6 years or so of this war, which is just a relentless bombing campaign against the people of Yemen, mass starvation for the children of Yemen, impunity for the Saudi airstrikes, including Saudi Arabia being able to bomb cholera treatment facilities and deliberately targeting food and like shipping like the Hadeda port and things like that. Then this war is going to go on until the Yemeni people are wiped out and Saudi Arabia can do whatever they want with their territory. So the idea here has to be that we withdraw our military support from Saudi Arabia and force the Saudis to come to some kind of deal with their neighbors to end this war in a way where the Yemeni people can have access to food going forward. All right, that's where I'll wrap up the show for today. Thanks everybody so much for tuning in. And again, thank you for being so understanding that I took the past week off of the show. Hopefully everything's going to be back to normal schedule-wise this week. Of course, anytime you're jumping back into it, it feels a little bit different. You got to kind of get back into the rhythm. But hopefully, again, at least 3 shows this week, writing some articles this week at the Libertarian Institute, news roundups out every day at the Institute. Just do what you can to support either the Institute or antiwar.com. Thanks, everyone.